Erin Callahan stood in the dim, oily light of her garage, the heavy oak workbench shoved aside to reveal a secret she was never meant to find. Her nursing uniform was stained with the dust of 30 years of silence as she stared at the ancient, grime-streaked phone vibrating in her hand. The screen flickered to life, illuminating a mosaic of photos that didn't belong in her world. A different house, a different life, and a family she had never met. The cold weight of the device felt like a live wire against her palm, a physical manifestation of a lie so vast it threatened to swallow the very floor beneath her feet. The rhythmic screech of the garage door rollers shattered the stillness, a sudden slab of afternoon light cutting through the shadows like a blade. Erin's heart collided with her ribs as she heard the heavy thud of her husband's truck door closing. She shoved the glowing device into her pocket, the fabric of her tunic straining against the evidence of his betrayal just as Tom stepped into the room, a bouquet of deep red roses in his hand. He stopped, his gaze dropping to the fresh gouges in the concrete where the workbench had been moved, then slowly rising to meet hers. In the suffocating silence, the scent of the flowers began to mingle with the smell of old grease. And for the first time in 3 decades, the man standing in the doorway looked like a total stranger. Erin Callahan gripped the edge of the industrial sink, her knuckles white against the stainless steel. With a sharp, rhythmic tug, she peeled the blue latex from her hands. The material snapped, releasing her fingers from the suffocating, powdered embrace of the gloves. She stood for a second, letting the air of the Youngstown General ICU hit her damp skin. It was a small mercy. Above, the fluorescent tubes hummed a relentless, flat B-flat, flickering just enough to make her eyelids twitch. The air here was thick, a heavy soup of bleach, floor wax, and the metallic tang of unwashed bodies. 12 hours of monitoring the staccato beep of heart monitors and the wet, mechanical wheeze of ventilators had left her hollow. She walked through the corridors, her sensible shoes squeaking on the linoleum, past the weary faces of the night shift. When she finally reached her driveway, the industrial silhouette of Youngstown loomed behind her like a rusted skeleton. She turned the key in the lock of the ranch-style house on Elm Street. Inside, the silence felt manufactured. The foyer smelled of lavender spray and lemon-scented furniture wax. Erin ran a finger along the mahogany console table. Not a speck of dust. The plush white carpet rose to meet her feet, swallowing the sound of her arrival. She sank onto the khaki sofa, surrounded by an order so perfect it felt like a museum exhibit. The stillness, once her sanctuary, now felt like a weight pressing against her chest. The garage smelled of cold concrete, old gasoline, and the dry, musty scent of seasoned oak. Erin pushed past the lawnmower, her eyes landing on the stack of cardboard boxes labeled 25th Anniversary. They were filled with gold-trimmed napkins and centerpieces she had spent months selecting. She moved toward the back wall, where Tom's heavy oak workbench stood like a fortress. With a grunt of effort, she shoved the massive piece of furniture aside. The wood groaned against the floor, scraping up curls of old sawdust and grit. Erin reached into the narrow, dark gap between the drywall and the back of the bench. Her fingers brushed something cold, hard. She hooked her hand around a small object and pulled it into the dim light of the single hanging bulb. It was an old smartphone, its black casing scarred and grime-streaked, held together by a jagged wrap of blue electrical tape. A thick layer of oily dust coated the screen. She pressed the power button with her thumb. Nothing. The screen remained a dead, obsidian void. They had shared a family plan for 2 decades. Every upgrade, every data limit was logged in her neat handwriting in the kitchen ledger. This device did not exist in their records. A sudden, sharp chill vibrated under her ribs, spreading through her limbs like spilled ice water. Erin dropped to her knees on the cracked garage floor. Her hands shook as she fumbled through a plastic bin of discarded electronics until she found a frayed charging cable. The Stecker clicked into the base of the black phone with a sickeningly final sound. She laid the device on the cold concrete, watching it like a coiled snake. Minutes ticked by, marked only by the distant, rhythmic thrum of the kitchen refrigerator through the wall. Then, without warning, the screen erupted into a harsh, clinical white light. Erin winced, her eyes burning. A logo pulsed on the glass, followed by a slow, agonizing loading bar. She bit her lip, the metallic taste of blood blooming on her tongue as she stared at the flickering battery icon. Her heart hammered against her sternum, a panicked bird trapped in a cage of bone. The phone gave a sharp, sudden vibration, signaling its readiness. Erin froze. She stared at the glowing glass, afraid to touch it, convinced the heat radiating from the screen would sear her skin to the bone. Her thumb hovered, then descended. She swiped through the icons, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. She tapped the gallery. The screen flooded with color, a mosaic of a life she didn't recognize. There was Tom. He looked younger, more relaxed, his arm draped around a woman with golden curls. They stood in front of a red brick house she had never seen, somewhere with more trees and less soot than Youngstown. She scrolled. Tom was at a backyard barbecue, flipping burgers, a toddler perched on his shoulders. The child had Tom's square jaw and deep-set eyes. Another photo showed them at a beach, the sun catching the wedding band on Tom's left hand. The hand he always claimed stayed bare because of circulation issues at the office. Erin felt the floor of the garage tilt. The images were a documentary of a shadow existence, a decades-long performance, where she had been the only one who didn't know the script. The sudden, rhythmic screech of metal rollers grinding against the tracks shattered the silence. Erin bolted upright, the sound of the garage door opening feeling like a physical blow to her spine. The heavy door groaned upward, dragging in a blinding slab of afternoon sunlight and the low, guttural rumble of Tom's Ford F-150. Panic surged, hot and acidic. She looked down at the smartphone in her hand. It was still vibrating with a sudden influx of notifications, the plastic casing feeling like a live coal against her palm. She shoved the device deep into the pocket of her nursing tunic, the fabric straining against the bulk. Her heart collided with her ribs in a frantic, uneven rhythm. Through the thin cotton of her uniform, she felt every pulse of the hidden phone, each vibration a ghostly scream from the woman in the photos. She smoothed her collar with a trembling hand and retreated into the shadows of the metal shelving unit, trying to steady her breathing as Tom killed the engine. Tom stepped out of the truck, a massive bouquet of long-stemmed red roses clutched in his hand. Their cloying, sugary scent immediately began to choke out the smell of oil and exhaust. He walked toward her, his stride confident, but his eyes remained sharp, darting across the garage floor. He paused, his gaze dropping to the heavy workbench she had moved. He noted the fresh, pale gouges in the concrete where the legs had dragged. His eyes snapped up to hers, dissecting the beads of sweat on her forehead and the way her right arm was pinned unnaturally against her hip. He held out the roses. A thorn snagged the skin of his palm, drawing a bead of dark blood, but his expression didn't flicker. He kept his eyes locked on hers, searching her dilated pupils for a crack in the facade. His silence a heavy, demanding weight in the humid air of the garage. Erin crossed the threshold into the dining room, where the air was thick with the scent of roasted meat and expensive lilies. The table was a sea of white linen and polished crystal. Emily stood by the sideboard, pausing as she reached for a bottle of Chardonnay. The girl's smile vanished the moment she saw Erin's face. She set the bottle down with a muffled thud and closed the distance between them. Emily's eyes, green and perceptive, scanned the waxen pallor of Erin's skin and the bruised shadows beneath her eyes. She reached out, her fingers brushing Erin's hand. The contact was electric. Erin flinched, her fingers like ice against her daughter's skin. Emily's brow furrowed, her gaze shifting toward the doorway where Tom stood, watching them with a practiced, easy grin. The atmosphere in the room turned viscous, a heavy tension settling over the fine china as Emily tried to decipher the sudden, shivering wall her mother had built around herself. Jake stood at the head of the table, hoisting a glass of amber bourbon. The chandelier light caught the liquid, making it glow like a warning light. His voice was loud, brimming with the easy confidence of a son who believed every myth he'd been told. He looked at the gathered guests, neighbors, colleagues, the social fabric of Youngstown, and began to speak of legacy. He talked about how Tom Callahan was a man who kept his word, a steel-belted father who taught him that a man's honor was his only true currency. Erin watched Jake's face, seeing the genuine adoration in his eyes, the way he squared his shoulders just like his father. Each word of praise felt like a physical strike. Jake called Tom a rock, a man of the old school who understood that family was a sacred bond. The phone in Erin's pocket felt like a lead weight, pulling her toward the floor, the gravity of the lie Michael was weaving making the very air feel too thin to breathe. Erin turned the brass thumb turn on the bathroom door and let the faucet run, the hiss of water creating a temporary veil against the laughter in the hallway. She pulled the black phone from her pocket. The screen ignited instantly. A new message sat on the lock screen, hovering over a photo of two blonde children playing in a sprinkler. The woman, her, wrote that the house was decorated for the weekend. She mentioned that the little one was asking when Daddy would be back from his latest business trip to the Midwest. Erin clamped her hand over her mouth, a silent, jagged sob catching in her throat. The pink 70s floor tile felt like dry ice beneath her shoes. The glowing letters on the screen blurred and ran together. A final, unappeasable sentence passed on 30 years of shared meals, holidays, and promises that had been nothing more than a meticulously maintained stage set. Tom slipped into the master bedroom, his movements silent and predatory. He wasn't looking for a screwdriver. He moved directly to the nightstand, his fingers dancing through the drawer with the efficiency of a seasoned thief. He slid his hand beneath the mattress, feeling along the seams of the box spring. He moved to the closet, parting Erin's dresses with a soft rustle of silk and polyester, his head tilted to catch the sound of footsteps in the hall. Every gesture was calculated, a quiet desperation underlying his search. He checked the pockets of her winter coat, his hands leaving behind a trail of microscopic disorder. A hanger tilted an inch too far, a jewelry box lid not quite flush. He was turning their sanctuary into a search grid, a hunter looking for the evidence he knew was somewhere within these four walls. The metal mailbox lid gave a sharp, hollow clang as Erin pulled out a stack of utility bills and flyers. Margaret Wilson, who had been busy hacking at her hedges with a pair of rusted shears, suddenly went still. She straightened her back, squinting through the harsh Ohio sun at Erin. A small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes twitched on Margaret's face. She leaned on her shears and remarked, with a voice like sandpaper, that Tom seemed to be traveling an awful lot these days. Always with that leather weekend bag on Friday afternoons. Margaret let it drop, almost casually, that she'd seen his truck merging onto the interstate heading south, miles away from the airport exit. Erin's grip tightened on the mail until the envelopes crinkled and tore. Margaret gave a slow, knowing shake of her head, a gesture that felt like a nail being driven into the coffin of Erin's denial. Erin sat in the dim glow of the kitchen, the blue light of the smartphone casting long, sickly shadows across her face. She navigated to the bank's mobile portal, her fingers stiff as she typed the password for their joint high-yield savings account. When the balance loaded, the air left her lungs in a sharp hiss. A six-figure sum had vanished. She scrolled through the transaction history, her eyes tracking a series of massive wire transfers to a trust fund she didn't recognize, registered in a zip code hundreds of miles away. Her fingertips went numb. This was the money for their retirement, the coastal fund they had joked about for a decade. Tom hadn't just been sharing his time. He had been systematically gutting their financial infrastructure to build a foundation for his other life. He was leaving her a shell, a hollowed-out house with no future inside it. The Rusty Spout Cafe smelled of burnt beans and the stale, sweet scent of floor cleaner. Erin sat in a corner booth, her back to the wall, her eyes jumping to the door every time the bell chimed. Richard Hansen slid into the seat opposite her, placing a heavy leather briefcase on the laminate table. Erin spoke in a low, frantic whisper, detailing the hidden accounts and the black phone. Richard listened, his face a mask of professional neutrality, his gray eyes unreadable. Erin pushed the printed bank statements across the table, her hands trembling. She looked at him, desperate for a legal lifeline, for some word of reassurance that the law would protect her from this theft. Richard slowly adjusted his glasses, and for a moment, Erin saw her own reflection in the lenses. A panicked, aging woman grasping at shadows. Richard didn't look at the papers. Instead, he reached across the table and placed a heavy, paternal hand on Erin's shoulder. His grip was firm, a subtle pressure that made it impossible for her to pull away without a scene. His voice dropped to a low, intimate rumble as he told her he'd already called Tom. He reminded her, with a thin, chilling smile, that he and Tom had been roommates at Ohio State, that they had navigated 30 years of complications together. He spoke of loyalty and the unfortunate misunderstandings of a long marriage. Erin felt a wave of nausea roll over her. The cup of coffee in her hand began to rattle against the saucer. The betrayal wasn't just in her bed. It was in the very institutions she thought would save her. The world she lived in was a closed loop, and Tom held the key. The kitchen was a cavern of shadows when Erin returned. The only light a pale, cold sliver from the street lamp outside. She stopped in the doorway. Tom was sitting at the oak table, perfectly still. Her leather handbag sat open before him, its contents, keys, lipstick, crumpled receipts, strewn across the table like debris from a wreck. Tom didn't move, but his breathing was heavy, a rhythmic, guttural sound in the dark. Beside the bag lay the black phone with its blue tape. Tom slowly lifted his head. In the gloom, his eyes were void of any warmth or recognition. They were the eyes of a stranger who had been living in her house for a quarter century. Erin took a step back, her heel catching on the edge of the rug, but her back hit the solid wood of the front door. Tom stood up. His shadow stretched across the linoleum, a long, dark spear that reached her feet. He didn't speak, but he began to wrap his fingers into tight, white-knuckled fists. Erin realized then that every second of their marriage had been a calculation, a strategic move in a game she hadn't even known she was playing. The man across from her wasn't her husband. He was the architect of her ruin, and the walls of the house she loved were beginning to feel like the bars of a cage. Erin moved down the stairs. The thick pile of the carpet muffled her descent, though her heart felt loud enough to wake the dead. Below, the living room was a theater of artificial joy. Tom stood at the center of a circle of friends, his movements fluid and practiced as he tilted a bottle of Veuve Clicquot. The champagne hissed into the flutes, the bubbles dancing in the light of the chandelier. He was in his element, his white shirt crisp, his laughter echoing off the walls. He looked every bit the successful patriarch, the man Youngstown envied. Erin watched him clap a neighbor on the shoulder, the golden liquid sparkling in the air, the scent of expensive cologne and roasted duck creating a suffocating cloud of perfect domesticity. Emily broke away from a group near the fireplace, balancing 2 glasses of champagne. She moved toward Erin with a grace that usually brought a smile to her mother's face. But as she reached out, the glass stopped short. Erin's hand was clenched so tightly into the fabric of her silk dress that her knuckles looked like polished bone. The distinct, rectangular outline of the black phone pressed against the fabric of her thigh. Emily's smile faltered, her gaze dropping to the trembling hem of Erin's skirt. She looked up, catching the raw, feverish light in Erin's eyes. The festive noise of the room seemed to drop away for a second, as Emily felt the tremors radiating from her mother, a silent alarm vibrating through the air between them. Tom reached for a silver bell on the mantel and rang it, the sharp, clear chime cutting through the layer of conversation. The room fell into an expectant hush. He squared his shoulders, his voice dropping into that rich, baritone register he used for closing deals. He began to speak of anchor points and unshakable foundations. He looked directly at Erin, calling her his North Star, the woman who had kept him steady through 30 years of storms. He spoke of loyalty as if it were a physical thing they had built together. Erin watched his mouth move, the lies flowing out of him with the smoothness of the champagne, each word a heavy, poisonous stone falling into the silence of the room. The taste of bile rose in Erin's throat, hot and bitter. "Unshakable trust," he had said. The phrase felt like a physical slap. She took a step forward, the sharp click of her heel on the hardwood floor snapping like a gunshot. Tom faltered, his glass poised midair, his eyebrows knitting together in a mask of concerned confusion. The air in the room grew thick, the oxygen seemingly sucked out by the sudden tension. Erin felt a surge of heat in her face, a fiery contrast to the clinical coldness she'd felt for days. She didn't look at the guests. She kept her eyes locked on Tom's, her jaw set with a sudden, jagged resolve. She reached into the fold of her dress and slammed the black phone onto the white linen tablecloth. It landed with a heavy, dull thud that made the crystal glasses jump. She swiped the screen. The blue light of the display cut through the warm amber of the room. There was the photo. Tom, the woman in the floral dress, the 2 children with his eyes, all of them laughing in front of a house that didn't belong to Erin. Tom froze. The glass in his hand began to chatter against his wedding ring, a tiny, frantic sound. A drop of champagne spilled, blooming like a tear on the dark wood of the table. Erin said nothing, letting the bright, digital proof scream into the silence of the room. The guests leaned in, a collective intake of breath hitching in the air. Jake pushed forward, his face drained of color under the bright lights. He leaned over the table, his eyes darting across the small screen, trying to make the image make sense. Erin watched his pupils dilate as he recognized the specific curve of his father's smile, the way his father held a grill spatula. It was a carbon copy of their own July 4th photos, but with a different family. Jake looked up at Tom, his expression shifting from confusion to a hollow, devastating realization. His shoulders slumped, the hero worship evaporating in a single, agonizing heartbeat as he gripped the edge of the table, his fingers bunching the expensive cloth into ruined knots. Tom's face went through a rapid, violent transformation. The shock vanished, replaced instantly by a look of profound, theatrical pity. He turned to the room, his voice loud and steady, the voice of a man dealing with a tragedy. He told the guests that Erin had been working too many double shifts at the hospital, that the stress of the ICU had finally snapped something inside her. He sighed, a heavy, performative sound, and told their friends not to be alarmed by her delusions or the falsified images her exhausted mind had conjured. He spoke with such conviction that Erin saw several neighbors begin to nod, their faces softening with a terrible, misplaced sympathy. Erin didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply tapped the screen again. A woman's voice, clear and intimate, filled the quiet living room. The recording played through the phone's speaker, the woman thanking Tommy for the wire transfer for the new roof and asking if he'd be home in time for the boys' birthday dinner on Sunday. The voice was full of a mundane, domestic love that was impossible to fake. The guests went still as statues. The lie was no longer a matter of interpretation. It was a physical presence in the room, as real as the roasted duck and the spilled wine. The sound of car doors slamming on the driveway echoed through the house, followed by the crunch of gravel as the last of the guests fled. The perfect evening had ended in a frantic exodus, leaving behind a wreckage of half-eaten food and abandoned coats. Erin stood in the center of the room, her gaze fixed on the white tablecloth. A spilled glass of Cabernet had soaked into the fabric, a dark, spreading stain that looked like an open wound. Tom stood by the fireplace, his silhouette jagged and trembling against the stone. The house felt cavernous now, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic, indifferent ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, marking the first minutes of a life that had been stripped of its foundation. Emily grabbed her coat from the brass rack, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. Beside her, Jake stood with his jaw locked so tight the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. He gripped his car keys with a white-knuckled intensity. Tom took a step toward them, his mouth opening to unleash a fresh torrent of explanations and context. But Emily whipped her hand up, a sharp, silencing gesture that cut him off. Jake shoved the heavy front door open. A gust of biting Ohio air swept into the foyer, smelling of wet pavement and winter. The door slammed shut with a bone-jarring thud that made the framed family photos on the wall shudder. Tom was left alone in the hallway, staring at the wood, the silence of the house finally closing in on him. Tom's face darkened to a deep, bruised purple. The veins in his neck bulged, pulsing with a raw, ugly energy. With a guttural snarl, he snatched a crystal flute from the table and hurled it. It shattered against the wall inches from Erin's head, the shards spraying across the room like diamond dust. One tiny sliver caught her cheek, drawing a thin line of red. He screamed that she had burned everything down, that she had traded 30 years of status for a single moment of spite. He kicked a mahogany chair, sending it skidding across the floor until it splintered against the sideboard. The mask of the respectable financial consultant was gone, leaving behind something feral and small. A man whose only remaining power was his capacity for rage. He stopped screaming. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a razor blade against her skin. He reminded her that his name was on the deed, the cars, the insurance policies. He smiled, a thin, cruel curl of the lip, as he described her future. A cramped apartment in the bad part of town, the smell of boiled cabbage and cheap detergent, the slow, grinding poverty of a woman her age with nothing to her name. He looked into her eyes, painting a picture of her as a forgotten relic, a broken woman who would wither away, while he simply moved his life to a different state. Erin didn't blink. She turned her back on him and walked toward the stairs, his hissed insults following her like shadows. In the master bedroom, she knelt by the far corner of the bed. She found the loose floorboard she'd prepared months ago, when the first doubts had begun to fester. She pried the wood up, her fingers finding the heavy, paper-wrapped bundle hidden in the joists. She felt the solid, reassuring weight of the cash. the result of 5 years of extra shifts, of stashing away grocery money and overtime bonuses he never bothered to track. She stood up, the envelope heavy in her hand. It was more than just money. It was the weight of her own agency, a secret he had never been smart enough to suspect. She looked at the room one last time, then walked out, leaving the house and the man behind in the gathering dust.